Andy, I am rolling whenever.
Are we good?
This is ready. And we are rolling.
First of all, thanks so much for coming in and agreeing to speak with us. This is, as you know, I'm sure Penny told you, for our bourbon museum, for our bourbon project, and we wanted your family's history to be a part of the gracious table, where we tell the stories of all the important people who were involved in this.
Well, you better put us on top.
Great thing we call Kentucky bourbon. All right, well, it depends how good you are.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you might have some say in that. If you're really good, you might eke towards the top. Tell me about that. And
Well, the connection is I was pretty young when they sold out, so everything I know about the family and so forth was told to me by someone else. And like all good Irish families, they had squabbles among each other. Some were drinkers, some were not drinkers. There were the problems of the family they're very tight-knit family, but they all had drinking problems too. Everybody in
Irish
the family,
not unique.
typically Irish family, they drank more than they ate, and I think they drank more than they sold too. So that's probably they didn't make the kind of money they might have wanted to.
Tell me what that name means to you. I mean, you see it.
Well, it means a lot. My mother's was a McKenna, her name. I have a daughter. No, I don't have a daughter. I have a granddaughter who was named McKenna. But my father lived here in Louisville. He was a Kelly. Kelly's a very common Irish name, second only to Murphy. And he had a tragedy is when he was born, his father was killed in a railroad accident. And his mother had to help raise him for a while. And he kind of got interested in my mother because he met her from school I went to in Bardstown, Kentucky, Nazareth. And he met her family and he identified with the family. McKenna was such an important, they were all that this little town of Fairfield, Kentucky was. Well, that was it.
Well, McKenna's.
It was McKenna Distilleries. And it employed the people busy time when they were canning them, making the whiskey and putting it away. And then the rest of the time they didn't have anything to do, so they were farmers and they did things like that, like everybody had to do. And they also, I think they drank quite a bit during the period when they weren't busy. The thing I remember about it myself, I was only maybe 10 or 11 when we sold out, so I didn't know any of the financial deals or what went on with the deal because I was too young, but I was told certain things. But I can remember watching the bottling process going on. They hired everybody from the little town, and everybody was related mostly to each other. And they all came together and had a lunch and then did their work. And they had the Kentucky state revenuers there put the tax types on the bottles. And that was an important job, and they let me do that. Put the stamp. And we also had the McKenna label. Now the whiskey was called Old McKenna, and old had to do with the age. McKenna was the fact that my great-grandfather founded the distillery, so he brought the name in.
It wasn't called bourbon at the time, but you could argue that your family brought bourbon in this way to make whiskey to the States and to Kentucky.
They probably made some Irish whiskey back in the old country. I don't know what that was like. Now, there's some really good Irish whiskey nowadays, and they drink a lot of that.
What do you drink?
Oh, I drink nothing but Henry McKenna. No, they have two brands. They have 100 proof, and they have about 87 proof like that, which is much more reasonably priced. None of it tastes as good as the original stuff, as I remember. But at 11 years old, you don't sit around tasting bourbon. You see it, and you see a lot of people who have bad effects by it. You know, automobile accidents, things that occurred in little towns because fights, things because people drank. And there was reason enough for prohibition to exist. We didn't think it was right, but it did.
And it was a great experiment, and it was a failed experiment, and we had to learn responsibility other ways, and that's what the country is about doing now. You're an Irishman, obviously, the Irish name.
Yeah.
Is there something that we in Kentucky can learn from the Irish whiskey makers?
Well, the successful ones, I'm a friend of Maker's Mark, Bill Samuels, everybody's a friend of him. He's a wonderful guy. I've dipped my own bottle with his wax on it and all that jazz. He's great. He searched for the perfect whiskey, this 365 or whatever the number is, and that's the perfect whiskey, according to him. But everybody has their own opinion.
Did he learn anything from your
Well, we sold a bunch of other brands too, besides McKenna. And they were named after members of the family. Old Joe was one of them, and Henry was another one. But none of these lasted too long. I do not know why, unless they named in the saloons where the drinking was done, they wanted to have different whiskey in each different bar. Henry McKenna had 3 sons who were in the business. My grandfather was named Stafford, and the oldest one was named James, and the third one was Daniel. Daniel, I know very little about because he had no children, so there was no involvement in the distillery. My grandfather was the salesman. They didn't have liquor stores and this sort of thing, so if you wanted to buy a good whiskey, you didn't go into the local saloon, because especially if you had a girlfriend or a wife with you, that was a despicable place to go, a disreputable place. So my grandfather would travel around the country. He'd go to Chicago and sell them on Kentucky McKenna whiskey at the Palmer House, which was the place where you took a nice lady and you had a drink or two before your meals, and you go to New York and go to the Waldorf Astoria. The Louisville would be Brown Hotel, if it were in existence then. But they had only the best, and they'd only carry one make. They didn't mix it up.
It was at the time in those white clay pots that you still see today, and that they're collector's items. People are
right. Well, they've got several ones. My cousin that I just discovered these down he lives in Davie, Florida, and he's younger than I am. I've got 2 first cousins still alive, and his father was active in the company for some years. But he's got a bunch of stuff that I haven't seen before.
What does that make you feel like, though, that people are collecting your family?
Yeah, well, but I've seen it many times in the Bourbon Museum in Bardstown, the Getz Museum. They have a whole room of McKenna, and it's everything. I used to see these things. When they closed the distillery, they took a lot of the stuff and gave them to the family, and then they lifted it around with aunts and uncles, and everybody had some, and now it's spread out, but it's finding your way back down. I was looking for a jug anywhere along, and I found a one in Danville, Kentucky. How it ever got to Danville, Kentucky, I don't know. But there must have been a collector's club of some sort where people save these things and resell them, But they're hard to find now. You don't find any that are worthwhile.
What does that make you feel like, though, when you?
Well, I'm proud of they're still around, that people still collect them. Sure, they're good name. We have no scandals in our family that I know of. They have. But,
it's a different product now. Obviously, Heaven Hill owns.
oh yeah, well, it almost died completely. Bourbon was just on the way to out the window when vodka and gin was the drink. I grew up drinking martinis and Manhattans. That was a high school, well, not high school, but college age drinking. We didn't drink straight stuff. And it just wasn't popular. And the bourbon just kind of died on the vine. People said it was a little, it actually sold better up east than it did down in these parts. And people were so used to it in Kentucky. I mean, they bought the cheapest stuff they could.
You've already told me you started drinking at 11 and then high school. What's your story going to be now?
Well, I started high school very young. Or very old, I guess it would be better to say. No, I know this is going through a phase right now, the popularity of bourbon.
Do you think so? I was going to ask you about. You think it'll go?
Oh, it'll change. It'll change. Sure, people's habits will change. I don't know. There's wine is, no wine was drunk around Kentucky at that time. They didn't make wine, and the bourbon people kept them out of the wine-making business. Till maybe 20 years ago, they didn't have any wineries in Kentucky, and it was lousy wine.
Yeah, well, there's a reason good bourbon comes from Kentucky,
yeah.
and there's a reason that good wine comes from Napa and Sonoma and other countries. So we talked a little bit about this, phase.
Yeah.
There are people telling the bourbon story now, and bourbon is very popular, but it is also nowhere near where Irish whiskey or Scotch is worldwide. So why do you think the popularity will wane?
Well, one of the things I loaned them here was the story that my Aunt Marcella wrote about the bourbon, the family business. And she made a trip around the state. She knew a lot of distillers. And she was born, she was younger than my mother, but she was born about 1905 or something like that. And she went around just to see if some of her friends had written stories about them, their family history about the bourbon industry, because she wanted to promote it. She was an author herself and wrote books. So she found out that nobody kept any records. I think they were trying to avoid the government. The government had such tight controls with the tax situation that they just didn't want anyone to know. First of all, they loved the Samuels and a lot of others, proud of their distilleries and their recipes, and that was tried to keep it hidden. You only use so much rye, or you only use so much corn, or just whatever. You didn't tell anybody about it.
It was unseemly at one time as an industry of stars.
Oh yeah.
I mean, Henry McKenna's a rock star.
Yeah.
Generations after he passed.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to me.
Well, I like the story, to tell a story. This was passed down the family. When he came to America, it was in the early 1800s. But he was the oldest son in the family, and he inherited the farm. So he had to make several trips back to Ireland to sign off, because he was going to stay in America. Well, we didn't have fax machines and things, so you had to go there and sign your name. So when he came back to America each time, he did this 3 times, he brought a brother or a cousin or something with him. And when they went through the customs, he'd say, well, who's this guy with you? And he says, well, he's my cousin. He speaks English. I've got a job for him with my family. I'm responsible for him. And the immigrant people who brought him in just signed off and said, he'll send him on through. That's probably why so many Irish came through, because they could speak English. And immediately in New York and places, they became firemen, they became policemen, they became politicians, because they spoke English. They could get ahead of the Germans and Slovakians.
It's fascinating because, they were millers. They were milling grains.
Yes.
And this whiskey, this bourbon, was really just a byproduct, a happenstance of it.
Well, an awful lot had to do with our water, our spring water. That's the secret of the good bourbon. If you don't take it out of the Ohio River and put it together, but that's probably it. But there's not many of these. I forget some statistic about turn of the century in 1800, or 1900, there were maybe 110 distilleries in the state of Kentucky. You would probably know more about the statistics of that. And what happened to a lot of them, and it happened in our case, we had no men to run the distillery. And it was unseemly. My mother had 5 sisters, but not one of them could work as an executive. They did manual labors in the distilleries, they did stuff, but they couldn't sign off, they couldn't be in the purchasing department, they couldn't do that. They just unseemly, that's what for a woman to do these jobs.
And it's hard work too.
Yes,
is not
exactly.
an easy, you're not just pushing buttons.
Yeah. So the men had to take over there, and we ran out of men, is what happened. My mother had nothing but daughters. I mean, she was nothing but daughters from Stafford McKenna. And James McKenna had one son, but he became a doctor, MD, and wasn't interested in the whiskey business. So that's when they sold the secret.
I'm fascinated that the number one thing that people boast about now in their bourbons is how many years in the barrel. Mm-hmm. Right? That's the thing.
Yeah.
Your great-grandfather figured that out.
Well, you could only, you had relatively small barns or whatever you kept your booze in, and you didn't want to keep it there too long, and there were people who stole that sort of stuff too, so you had to be careful. I don't know, I remember up in Bardstown, they had a fire one time, the bourbon caught on fire, and people came from all around, the buckets and pans and stuff. It was burning, and they were dipping it in these things. I don't know how many people survived or how much whiskey was stolen from this time of stuff, but it ran down like Niagara Falls down the hill, and the people at the bottom of the hill, they couldn't drink it right out, like out of a volcano. But it's been treated strangely for years and years and years. But I'll tell you one of the reasons I think it became popular. People came to the Derby. By the way, I've been to 73 of them myself.
Really?
And drunk about 73 times 3 Marsh Minchilla. But they brought people, and the Kentuckians are very hospitable, they're very friendly, all that stuff. And the first thing my dad was famous for it. He had a retail office supply business down here. If you stayed after work, if you were in the office or whatever, he'd say, hey, it's drink time at 5:05 or whatever he decided it was, and he says, and all he served was bourbon. But there were people from all around the country that would come through, and Dad would give them bourbon. And so I remember one guy asking for scotch. My father said, scotch? I don't sell scotch. I don't give scotch. I just I want to know how you like your bourbon.
Neat or on the rocks?
Neat or on the rocks. That was it. It didn't mix. The cheap stuff you might drink with a Coke, but boy, you had the good stuff, strictly on the rocks or water.
I read yesterday, though, that your great-grandfather wouldn't sell it before it was 3 years in the barrel.
Yes.
At the time, that was cutting edge. Everybody was getting their product out as quickly as they can. Do you think that's what led to the quality and made it so desirable?
Yeah, I don't know how the wine people would get their quality, but they control it nicely. There's some doings in that business. I don't know how they do that, but I certainly know a good one from a bad one. And it's nice to see the good ones getting their just due, mm-hmm. You know. Why do we need to have all these hundreds and thousands of barrels of, or bottles of wine that are on these shelves of these bars you go into now? You got all this stuff to look at. Lord, you don't need all that stuff. You just need the bourbon, maybe a little gin.
Was 3 years in the barrel important to the recipe?
Oh, that was the minimum. Yeah. Oh, sure. The older, the better. But you can't save it long. The cork does bad things to bourbon. My cousin had one last bottle that was bottled in about 1935, something like this, which would have really been valuable if it were still. But he said the cork disintegrated and then it's no good at all. So he opened it up and tasted it, and he said it was miserable.
Oh, no.
Floating cork. So you can't say like wine is done for years and years and years. Even though they use cork too, they probably didn't have very good cork.
Tell me about the McKenna Act.
McKenna what?
The legislation.
Oh yeah, they fought the revenuers. They tried to put the legislatures in their pockets by giving them some free booze. But I don't know much about how that went about. I know the country on the whole was pretty sad about it. It was a fight in Kentucky with the Baptists and the Catholics. Catholics all drank and the Baptists all didn't drink. Or they didn't let the Catholics know they were drinking. But yeah, it was a religious thing here in Kentucky. It may not have been throughout the stations, throughout the country, but Kentuckians, you didn't go to social whiskey drinking churches. They enjoyed it, but they didn't just try to make a big deal out of it. But anyway, I guess the prohibition didn't work, so they canceled it.
Yeah.
It was all for the best.
It was repealed.
And then, you see, it was hard to find then after prohibition ended, because most of it had been drunk up or something's happened to it.
How old are you now?
Oh, I'm pretty young now. I'm about 5 or 6.
5 or 6?
Yeah.
You remember Prohibition?
No, I don't remember Prohibition. No. I know that my parents always had whiskey around the house, though. Of course, they had it stashed different places. When this old aunt I had died, they found in her bedroom she had hollowed out a part of the wall and put some booze back there for her own personal use.
Really?
It didn't tell anybody about it, so they never found it until she was dead. And this was probably in the 1960s, something like that.
When you were young, your parents were hiding the hooch. Was it because of Prohibition at that time? Mm-hmm. Were they brand loyal? Was it Henry McKenna?
Nah.
It was whatever.
I don't think so. There was no major brand like Jack Daniels or whoever would be. Old Fitzgerald used to be one of the biggies, but a lot of them have changed. I don't think, now the people, high-class people who are in the business, the Stitzelweller, old Pappy Van Winkle, I mean, he would die to think his whiskey is going for the prices it's going. And the worst, one of the worst, I shouldn't say anything, was Four Roses was a terrible whiskey. And now it's a big deal. They charge a big price for it. They have several different brands, but back then you knew not to drink it. Even when you were beginning to be nurtured with whiskey, you avoided Four Roses.
Yeah, it was a blend. It was bad. It's not anymore. Now it's a very good bourbon.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was bad.
Well, they can do some things to perk up it, and as long as the ball is rolling, the bourbon people ought to take advantage of it. And I think what Fraser has in mind here to make us the starting place of the bourbon trail is great. You'd sell tickets and you'd sell tours and all that kind of stuff. And people come to Louisville and we have all these nice museums. Why not start here and then walk across the street and have a drink?
That's a beauty. I couldn't have said that any better myself. Well done. So you have a chance. You're going to be in this bourbon museum. One of the people telling stories, along with, the Brown family and Bill Samuels and Jimmy Russell and some of these legends in the industry. What do you want to know? What do you want people to know about the Henry McKenna brand and your name and your family?
We're going to have some interesting souvenirs. I mean, some of the stuff that my cousin has are really great stuff. I don't want to, I think the Getz Museum has more than their share of stuff, and they don't. I think a lot of it's going to go through the family. All my kids, I didn't know who I was going to leave. I've got those half a dozen jugs that are pretty old, but I've run out of. I don't have so many jugs that I have enough for the kids, but you know, you wanted a display now, a movable display. You know, you could have one for Old Forester or whatever, one for McKenna. McKenna was always small potatoes now, but it was high quality. All right.
And why do you think it was such high quality? Why do you think that was so important to Henry McKenna?
Well, he
to make
was
it
a
happen?
proud man. You know, he only made the best, and that was his. He could have tripled his business in his first couple of years, and he said no. There's just a certain amount that's worthwhile, and then after that, it's not good. Anyway, he never wanted to grow, and he didn't have the family to grow with.
Right, because
See,
you
if he'd
said-
had he had grandchildren, but didn't have great grandchildren.
Okay.
And,
And then he had all those girls, and so many
Yeah, the
businesses
girls
die
were-
out.
And
Yeah.
all they did was drink. That's
That's
the
what
thing.
happened to our family business. Well,
They couldn't.
Into the profits.
Yeah.
if you could tell.
Somewhere in my records, this doesn't mean much, but they kept a bookkeeping, so forth, and they didn't pay their employees much money because he didn't have much money in the farming business. But they gave him a little whiskey. The guy who was the distiller of the Irishman, he got himself a gallon of whiskey a month. Now, that gallon of whiskey a month was his to do with what he wanted. But who knows how much he sniffed and stole or whatever else. So he may have turned that gallon into 10 gallons. But they didn't make much money. They got some whiskey, they got some products, corn, things they could sell. But nobody got rich.
What is one of the stories that's been passed down in the family about Henry McKenna the man that you think people should know?
Well, my aunt tells the stories pretty well in that sheet that we have, the stories that I know. There are probably others that I didn't know. My mother was pretty young when her grandfather died, so she didn't know him very well. She was thoroughly indebted to her father. He was close to her. And she went to school in Bardstown, Kentucky, to the Catholic Girls' School.
Yes.
And
Catholic
there were girls from Louisville who came out there.
Mm-hmm.
So they also had things like dances, and so some boys from Louisville, they had an interurban that came to Bardstown.
From Louisville.
From Louisville.
And you know the location of that school, of course, is right where the Getz Museum is today.
Yes, that's
so it
right.
all comes home.
Yeah, it all comes home.
That school is
Right.
right there in the center of Bardstown. It was really the center of.
So that's how my father actually met my mother. He went out to succeed to a high school dance and came back, and while he was there, he met her, and
he
she
met
came.
her, and the rest is history.
Yeah, and then she came into Louisville because she had met some girls from Louisville, kind of highfalutin girls from Louisville, you know.
Yeah.
The country girls were not too much, but my dad found a family. And he had a choice of 6 dates too, 6 girls to
Yes.
work on. So it was. I'm sure that this story is not unlike any Kentucky story. You know, we go back a few generations. My wife goes back 6 or 7 generations, but I'm not that far.
So do you? The distillery's been torn down.
Yeah.
In Fairfield.
Well, it was first. We were sold to Seagram's, and they ran it for a
Right.
while. And there are a few bottles and things that they came up with, and they promoted it for a while, and then it kind of ran out of. There was no money put in investment and no money to upkeep the place.
Have you
And-
been out there to look at the ruins of the distillery?
Oh, it's terrible. I just don't want to look at it anymore. The best thing they've got going is the church, St. Michael's Church, which
Yes.
is still going strong.
That's great.
And my grandfather was married there. My mother and father were married there. They're all married there. So, but that's worthwhile. That's the only reason to go to Fairfield. You don't want to see anything else. It's in between Bardstown and Bloomfield.
From Bloomfield.
Yeah, and that's it.
That's it.
Just
huh?
pass by and keep on moving.
Well-
Bring your whiskeys from somewhere else.
Well, you know, a lot of these old distilleries are getting rebuilt as the brand,
Yes.
you know, as the category grows. And you think about the success of Old Taylor, which of course is now Castle and Key, and
Yeah.
it's not as old. Old Taylor's not as old as Old McKenna, but
The Broad and Graham is a good example of how they redid that.
yes,
That's
exactly.
wonderful.
So maybe there'll be a future for Henry McKenna.
Yeah, there
the
might be,
distillery.
but since there's no family around there anymore, I don't think so. But I won't get to see it. But I've seen a lot. 73 derbies, that's a
Yeah,
bunch.
that's a lot. It's
It's
impressive.
a lot of races to lose on.
Well, Andy, do you have anything
I
else?
don't. I don't. Did you have anything else you want to add about
Tell
your
us about
family,
Henry
about your?
McKenna.
Oh, there's lots of sad stories. You know, people
Tell
that,
us a sad story,
well, oh, I don't know.
unless you don't want to.
Oh, I don't know.
Tell us
how-
a sad Irish tale.
Well, no, I think that I like the stories about bringing cousins over from the old country, because you could, in America, you can't, we're so worried about refugees now, we don't want to have anything to do with them. In those days, they welcomed them, you know. The Irish came because it reminded them of Ireland. It looks just like it. The weather's very similar. They don't have snow in Ireland, we don't have snow here.
It's interesting you said that, because I was on a tour recently and they said there are 3 places that have the perfect limestone shelf for the perfect water.
Mhm.
Ireland, Irish whiskey, Scotland, Scotch,
All right.
and Kentucky.
Yeah, we
Scotch.
wouldn't be anything without that. That's what made our industry flow. And I guess through all the wars, you know, I believe Lincoln was saying about Grant, who drank to excess. And he said, if you give me more bottles of what he's been drinking, and so I can feed them to my other generals. So he couldn't keep them working. But whiskey goes back a long time. Bourbon, not so long.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I appreciate it.
Well, I probably told a few lies, but I'll be
Spin a
forgiven.
few tales. That's all right. It's not like we're going to put it in a museum or anything.